Okay, so what I'm going to give you guys is I'm going to give you a gentle introduction to S3 data lakes and why this might matter to you if you're using SQL Server, in particular SQL Server 2022. To use the Microsoft notation, which signifies, you know, the depth of a session, 100 through to 500. This is probably somewhere between 200 and 300. So it's kind of a gentle introduction, a gentle introductory session, and absolutely not the kind of session where you'll come away from at the end and your brain will be melting and leaking out through your ears. Okay, so Data Lake 101. I'm guessing that there's probably people watching this who are doing things with data lakes, but for the benefit of the uninitiated, what a data lake is, it's basically a data repository. It's divided into different zones. So depending on whose material you read, there'll be different names for these zones. So Databricks like to go with a naming convention based on metals. So that's silver, bronze, and gold. But whatever the naming is, the general convention is that you have zones. You usually have at least 3 of these. You have a raw zone in which data lands in the exact same format. It's stored in the source system. So say, for example, you were dealing with CSV data, or you were dealing with, I don't know, a web service, for example, the native data format that is JSON. You scrape from your web service and you land your data in the raw landing zone in JSON format. And then what you do is you have what's called an enriched zone. Again, different people might have use different naming conventions, but if I describe what each one's for, you should get the general idea. And what you do is you deduplicate the data. You would conform it. So if you've got stuff with different date formats, you might have put conform the data around one specific date format. And then finally, you'd have I've called it a presentation zone here. You might store the data in files such that you can easily scoop it up via, I don't know, something like Azure Synapse, Snowflake, a cloud-based scale-out relational database system. And the whole idea of this is to minimize the movement of data. So I'm presuming there's people watching this session who have used integration services, and you'll be familiar with the fact that the whole thing can end up like a Rube Goldberg machine. You know, you can have tons of different steps, data flying all over the place, and where you kind of end up is you end up in a place where you're spending more time debugging, maintaining, creating ETL than you are in actually getting it into a state where you can load that data into its end destination. Okay, and no matter how you do this, the one common denominator is that you need object storage. So this is a Microsoft focused community. So I'm guessing there's folks on here who are familiar with Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the view from the world of S3. Okay, so what is S3? It stands for Simple Storage Service. It originated at AWS. However, one of the the key differences between S3 and, say, Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 is that you can find S3 in more places than just the cloud, and I'll get onto what and where those places are. It's immutable, so you create a file or an object in S3. All you can do with it is basically create it in the first instance or delete it. You have these things called buckets, and a bucket is kind of like a namespace for containing your files and objects. Objects can be organized by prefixes. You can also have folders, and you access this thing via HTTP or HTTPS. So for the purpose of this session, what I will be doing is I'm going to give you a bunch of free tools, and the things I'm going to talk you through are the things that you can use with S3 anywhere, not just the AWS cloud. Okay, so if you wanted to, when people are playing around with things, there's a tendency to want to do it in a cost-effective manner. Nobody particularly wants to have to sell the farm when you're learning something. There's things like Minio, you can run them on your laptop. I'm going to give you tools which are going to allow you to use S3 no matter where that is. And even though I've mentioned here that the access protocol is HTTP or HTTPS, the tools that you'll use, so I'm going to give you a command line tool, a GUI tool, I'm going to do a bit of stuff in Python, that is largely abstracted away from you. Okay, so if we're talking about S3 in the AWS cloud, although it's subtly different to Azure, you still have things like regions, availability zones. By default, all your data is made highly available across all zones in the region. You can optionally make data highly available across regions, but the default is high availability across all regions, which is usually 3. Okay. You have things like lifecycle policies. So what you can do is you can set policies on a bucket to age data out to different tiers, which brings you on to frequent and infrequent access tiering. You have this thing called AWS Glacier, and that is like a really cheap and deep cold access tier, but you need to be careful when using that, and I'll get on to exactly why that is. You can have event notifications, which can trigger off things like Lambda functions. So they're kind of similar to Azure functions. And then you have access control, which can be via IAM, Identity and Access Management, AWS, or Access Control List. And then finally, you have object versioning for all objects. Okay, so I mentioned that you can run S3 in different places. So there's software-defined solutions out there. There's things like Minio. That's incredibly popular. It's a cheap and easy way for you to dip your toe in the water. You've got the public cloud. And when I say public cloud, you haven't just got AWS. You've got GCP, which supports S3. You've got DigitalOcean, and I think there's a few others as well. And also you have hardware appliances. So I work for a vendor. We produce a hardware appliance which supports S3. Most of the major hardware vendors also do that. The one big takeaway from this slide is that even though S3 can be found in multiple places, the kind of gold standard for S3 is AWS. So one thing I want to make you brutally aware of is that if you're playing around with this, okay, and if you choose to do this somewhere that isn't AWS, you shouldn't expect that wherever that other place is, it's going to give you everything that AWS's S3 implementation gives you. Okay, so the takeaway is that the different forms of S3 you can find in different places are not all equal. AWS is the gold standard. Okay, a few fun facts for you. S3, it was the first storage service to hit production in AWS. It's used via the likes of Netflix, Wikipedia, the New York Times. I presented this material live at conferences, and what I would say is, if there's anybody from Microsoft in the room, please close your ears. But it's the world's most popular object storage standard, and that is kind of by virtue of the fact that it's been around much longer than anything else, and also it's due to the fact that it's supported by different clouds other than just AWS, and also there's on-premises and software-defined solutions. Okay, so it's designed to scale to handle billions of objects. It truly is. If you read upon this, it is a real cloud engineering marvel, and it's supported by just about all the popular big data tools, so things like Kafka and also Spark. Okay, a bit of a myth about S3 is that it's slow. For sure, it is absolutely not a low latency storage platform. Okay, so if your starting point is that you want low latency storage, S3 is probably not for you. And part of that is because it was never designed for that use case. Its original use case was to store static web content. Okay. Also, I mentioned that it's accessed via HTTP and HTTPS. They are absolutely not low latency storage protocols. However, if you're talking about I/O bandwidth, the story is completely different. And if you're using S3 and AWS, okay, the way you scale things out in terms of performance is you use prefixes. Okay, you use object prefixes. There's no limit to the number of these you can have in a bucket. The more of these you have, the better performance you will get. Okay. Also, I mentioned that there's different storage tiers. There's this thing called AWS Glacier. This is a cautionary tale that I plucked off Twitter. So the way that AWS works in charge of billing is that they charge a transfer fee per every 1,000 transfers of objects to Glacier, and at 6 cents per 1,000 transfers, it might not sound a lot, but if you're dealing with the hundreds of millions, even billions of tiny files, well, guess what? This soon adds up. Okay, so I think in this specific case, I think whoever the organization was that did this, they thought they were going to save some costs, go from $94 to $21, and I believe that because of the sheer number of files, they ended up paying thousands and thousands of dollars. So please be aware of this. Okay. So how does S3 compare to Azure Blob Storage? I've got Blob Storage here. How does S3 compare to Azure Storage? Full stop. Okay. So As some of you will probably know, you've kind of got this tiered access system in Azure. You start out your subscription, you can have multiple storage accounts per subscription, and you can associate different storage types with different storage accounts. Okay, in the world of S3, things are incredibly flat. You have a subscription, you create a user, you have a user associated with your subscription by default, and there's two key pieces of information that you use for accessing S3, okay? And they are an access key ID and an access key secret. And basically what they are is they're two really long strings. If you see them, they'll just look like a complete gibberish of numbers and characters, but the combination of those two things is how you access your S3 endpoint. Okay, and again, that could be S3 in the cloud, it could be S3 on premises, it could be S3 on a software-defined platform like MinIO. Okay, and again, just to illustrate this, with AWS, to reiterate the point, you don't have any concept of storage accounts. Things are incredibly flat. Okay, responding to events. One of the really popular things to do with object storage and data pipelines. So basically, a data pipeline, it's one or more processors which move data from one place to another and transfer the data. You might be thinking, well, this kind of sounds like ETL. The key difference here is that its data pipelines tend to be a lot broader in scope than things that just land data in a data warehouse. And one of the really popular things to do with a data pipeline, which uses a data lake, is to have event-driven processes. Okay, so what you might do with Azure, you might use Event Hub to capture events such as object creation events from your storage. So I've got Azure Blob storage here, and then you could use that to trigger off things like Azure Functions, Azure Logic Apps, web hooks, and workflow runbooks. You can do. Me move on. You can do more or less the same with S3. You can use the console. I've got some Python code here, but what you can do is you can say that you want your bucket to generate event notifications. So every time an object gets created, an event notification gets created. And what you can then do is you can then respond to that event by triggering off a Lambda function. And if you know anybody into AWS, or if there's any of you that dabble in it, you'll know that people that come up with solutions in AWS, they really seriously love to stitch things together with AWS Lambda. Okay, so quick demo for you. I've got a hands-on demo near the end, and I'm going to walk you through some simple Python. Okay, let's have a quick look at what creating a bucket looks like. Okay, so we've gone into the AWS console. Going to create bucket. We're going to give it a name. Notice it's associated with a region. Okay, I'm going to change that. Okay, I'm going to give my bucket a name. Okay. And I'll come on to block public access after this. Okay. We'll create our bucket. Okay. we're going to go into IAM and get a access key ID and an access key secret. Okay, go to our user. I've already got one here. Okay, security credentials. And we're going to create an access key. Okay, so just to come back to one of the things that I mentioned, which is blog public access. And you might be thinking, well, why would you want that? I mean, that is crazy talk, you know, even considering public access to the objects. And the reason for that is because S3's original use case was for static web content. If you've got a website and if people are surfing it, in order for them to see, I know, PNG files or whatever static content you've got that is associated with that, if that's in an S3 bucket, you need to enable public access, okay? For the purposes of what we're doing, you should never, ever do that, okay? So that's a quick FYI. This is the, obviously, this is the AWS console. No matter how you slice and dice this, wherever you use S3, you always need an access key ID and a secret access key. Okay. I'm also guessing there's people watching this that do a bit of coding. You push stuff up to GitHub. Never, ever, ever, ever push anything up to GitHub or any public facing repo that contains your access keys or access secret keys. People do that, and it's not a good place to be in. So if you're using GitHub and you need to store them in a file, damn well make sure that you use a git ignore file, okay, to make sure that that file containing your access key ID and access key secret are not pushed up to GitHub or any other public facing code repository, full stop. Okay, moving on. Okay, making buckets secure. So buckets are private by default, and for what we're talking about, I can't see any reason why you should ever change that. When you create your bucket, you're the only person that's got access to it. You can give access to other users in your account, using other accounts, or anyone in with an internet connection. And again, to reiterate the point that not all implementations of S3 are born equal, the nuance around the security may change depending on where you're using S3. Okay, so this all, at the moment, this pertains to S3 in AWS, this specific slide. Okay, you can restrict bucket access to IP ranges and stroke or enforce multi-factor authentication. You can block public access at the bucket or account level. And also, I mentioned the thing about static websites. Permissions can go down to the folder level. However, there's a but and a gotcha here. Okay, and I'll get onto exactly what that is. Okay, so just to reiterate the structure of our data lake, how would you structure this? Okay, so you could put everything in a single bucket, and that would work absolutely fine. You probably don't want to do that if you're just playing around with this. Download MinIO on your laptop, put everything in a bucket. That is absolutely fine for kicking the tires, but for a data lake, you probably want to do something different. You probably want a separate bucket per zone. You could use one bucket. You could create different folders in it. You can control permissions that way. However, there's a trade-off here. Okay, and that trade-off is security versus performance. The more nested folders you have in a bucket, okay, the worse that is for performance, because what happens is every time you access something in a folder, the engine that underpins S3 has to go away and check access control lists. The deeper that you nest your folders, the worse this gets. So just be mindful of that. Okay, so this is a bit more of a nuanced scheme here. You've got you work for a particular organization. Say, for example, you're listed on one of the world's major stock exchanges. So the New York Stock Exchange, for example. You've got marketing campaign data. For sure, you don't want your competitors or anybody outside your organization to get access to that. But you've also got sales data. Okay. If that got out and that was leaked before your organization released its numbers to the Securities Commission, that probably would be catastrophic in terms of the fines you'd be hit with. So you probably want to think about segregating your data in terms of its sensitivity. You've also got things like GDPR to consider. Finally, when your data ends up in your presentation zone, what you'll probably do is you'll probably aggregate that up. So it might be more difficult for somebody with malicious intent to actually reverse engineer that data and pick out specific points of interest which a bad actor could use against you. Okay, so I mentioned tools. The first one I'm going to give you is this command line tool. Okay, S5 CMD, and there's a whole bunch of other command line tools out of there. I've got S3 CMD, S4 CMD, the AWS CLI, Goofus. The reason I'm telling you should look at this is because it's blazingly fast. Okay, so it absolutely thrashes anything else out there in terms of performance. It does this because it's written in Golang, which is incredibly fast. Also, it leverages parallelism. The other reason you should consider using this is because you can use it anywhere. Okay, so I've used this quite happily against S3 in AWS and also S3 on the scale out file and object appliance my employer sells, and it works seamlessly across both those implementations. And I'd imagine that if you were using something like MinIO, it would work perfectly well with that as well. And also, it's free. Okay, so let's have a quick look at this. So this is something I've recorded on my MacBook, so you can basically run this anywhere that supports Golang, so Mac OS, Windows, Linux. Okay, I can list what buckets I've got. Okay, I can actually list the contents of a bucket. Nothing in there, so let's go ahead and create something. Let's be wildly imaginative and echo Chris to a file called chris.txt. Okay, let's copy that file to a bucket. Okay, and we can now see that's there. Okay, we can remove the file. Okay, list the contents of our bucket, and we can see that it's gone. Okay. The way this works is you'll notice that I'm in a directory called .aws. You create what's called a credentials file. This is all, if you look for S5 CMD, this is all documented. And in that credentials file, you stick your secret, your access key ID and your access key secret. Okay. And by default, it will look for your data in S3. What you can do is there's you'll notice in the global options, roughly 2/3 up the screen is this thing called --endpoint URL. What you can do is you can specify that to point to an endpoint other than AWS. Okay. Next tool I'm going to give you, CyberDuck. And again, this is completely keeping in the theme of giving you things which are free and easy to use and will work wherever you want to use S3. Okay, so this is a GUI-based tool. Okay, so let's have a look at what this looks like. So again, this is on my MacBook with Mac OS. You can quite happily run this on Windows. So I'm just looking at some of the buckets I've got. And we can go and put something in a bucket, create a simple file, copy it to the bucket, go back into CyberDuck, and there's our file. We can download it, and once it's downloaded, we can use whatever text editor we like the most to see what's in there. Okay, so that's a really simple GUI tool. Okay, the last thing I'm going to give you is this thing called Boto3, and what that is it's the Python SDK for AWS. Again, it's free, and also again, this will work quite happily wherever you want to use S3. So I've used this against AWS. I've used this against the appliance that I work with, and it works equally well with both things. Okay, so I've got a canned demo in here. What I'll do is I'll come out of PowerPoint and I'll actually give you this demo hands-on. Okay, so I've created a bucket here. Let me just go back. Can everybody see this? Can everybody see the AWS console in the browser?
We can.
Yeah, great. So it feels a bit like being in a séance at times when you're talking into something, and there's like, you might get a disembodied voice come back. Anyway, I've got a bucket here called Cloud Data Driven. Nothing in it. Okay, so that's not particularly exciting. So let's make things exciting. So what I've got here is I've got some Python code. Okay, and what we're going to do is we've got our main function here. I'm using this thing called Tweepy, and that is an API to Python. Okay, you'll notice that this thing called a bearer token. To use this, you will need a Twitter developer account. Again, this is free to use. I'm absolutely sure that they apply some form of throttling. So if you wanted to build a social media sentiment analysis platform based on this, I suspect that they've got thresholds at which they would throttle you back. Okay, but for the purposes of a simple demo, playing around with something you're not going to hit those thresholds. Okay, so let's go back into our Python code. So what we're doing here is we're getting the text for a bunch of tweets. We're supplying the bearer token that we get via our Twitter developer accounts. That is stored in an environment variable called bearer_token. We supply a Twitter query. Okay. We're going to build a data frame with pandas. And then what we're going to do is we're going to split the data frame into chunks. Okay. And we're going to turn each chunk into a CSV file, which is going to land in our bucket. Okay. And all these things that you see here, well, it says os.environ, and I've got a name in single quotes in the open square brackets. All those things are stored as environment variables. Okay, so if we come out of that and I say env, there they are. Okay, right. So let's give that a run. So I say Python. Before I do that, let me go back in. Okay, because the bit I should really point out to you. So when I'm building the data frame, I'm sentiment scoring each tweet. Okay, the bit that should be really of interest is this little function here. Okay, this is where I'm calling Otto3. This is a Python library which you install with pip, just the way you'd install any other library or module. Okay. What I'm doing here is I'm connecting to S3. Okay. And I'm generating a CSV name, and then I'm calling this thing called s3.object to create a CSV file for my tweets, and that's going to land in my bucket. Okay, so I don't know how au fait people are with Python. I kind of okay. I kind of know my way around it a bit, but trust me, it is not difficult to use. And there's a ton of examples out there. So I found that Stack Overflow is a really good place to look for, answers and snippets of code for how to do things. There's some examples in the AWS documentation as well. Okay, so that's the code. So let's run that. And it should take a couple of seconds, unless I get hit by the curse of when you're presenting something, time seems to slow down. Okay, that was quite fast. So let's go and look in our bucket. Okay, no objects found. Okay, why is that? Okay, so refresh always works like a charm. So I've got a number of files in there. Okay, so let's have a quick look at some of them. So S5CMD LS. Let's list what's in my bucket. Okay, and what I can do is I can say S5CMD cat and give it this path. Okay, I can supply the name of a file. Okay, and what I've used as a query, I've used SQL Server 2022. You can see that there's query text in there. These numbers at the end of these numbers at the end of the Twitter text, that's sentiment score information. There's stuff in there. I'm guessing that's Mandarin Chinese. There's all sorts of weird and wonderful things you could do. So I've gone for the most basic option possible. You could do things such as, say, you own a filter for tweets or scrape tweets for a specific language. You could scrape tweets which have got retweets in. There's lots of things, lots of different ways you can slice and dice this. Okay. What I've done is I've stored the files in a CSV format. If you were doing something with an actual data lake, what you would do is you would land the data in its native format in a landing or staging or a raw zone. So it will be JSON in this case. And what the general tendency to do is to store the data in the different zones in Parquet. There's a brilliant Microsoft article called The Hitchhiker's Guide to Data Lakes. I recommend that you read that if data lakes are of interest to you. It does cover, as you might expect, it's Azure Data Lake Gen 2 focused. However, a lot of the principles in there apply to data lakes irrespective of what platform you're building them on. Okay. In that, it generally recommends Parquet, Orca, and Arrow file formats are recommended if you think that the I/O access pattern for your data is going to be more sort of skewed towards writes rather than reads. Okay, so that was a quick demo with Python. The code for that demo is in my GitHub repo. It's in the material. So Kevin, what's the deal with material? Do I give you the deck and you make it available? Kevin? We've lost Kevin. Okay.
No, sorry, a hard day to press the unmute button. No, if you just want to send it over to me or put it into this channel, that'll be perfect.
Okay, I will do that with pleasure. Okay, so let's go back to the deck. I've given you the demo live. Okay, so where does Microsoft come into this picture? A bit of a spoiler. I kind of mentioned this up front in the title, so I've kind of given it away that it absolutely does. Okay, a simple pipeline. A popular means of landing the data. I'm not saying that you should do this, but depending on the use case, you may want to do this. Is to use some sort of streaming tool such as Kafka, Spark, in particular Databricks is wildly popular for wrangling your data, for getting it into an enriched and conformed state. And then once your data is in a curated state and you've landed it in the final zone, I mentioned this earlier on, you might want to scoop that up using a database engine. Well, guess what? With SQL Server 2022, what Microsoft have done is they've extended Polybase so that you can create an external table for S3. Okay, and there's two ways of doing this. You can use open row set embedded in a query, or you can use an external table. My preference is to use an external table simply because it gives you all the benefits of a table. Also, every time you want to query it, you don't have to mess around with working out what the open row set query syntax is. No matter what you do, you have to enable Polybase, Also, you need, and I need, and this was the case when I used it last time, you need an SSL certificate for your S3 endpoint, but this absolutely works, and it gets better. Okay, so this session is specifically on S3, but I just thought I'd mention that Microsoft have really hit the ball out of the park here and have given you a bunch of goodies. So they've also extended Polybase to support Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, Azure Blob Storage, Parquet format files, Delta table format files. So there's this thing called Delta Lake. It's kind of like a it's from Databricks. I believe that Synapse also supports it as well. It gives you a transactional layer on top of your data lake. And this last thing is quite interesting. You can perform a create external table as select. So if for any reason you've got data in your SQL Server database and you want to extract that and land it in an S3 bucket, Data Lake Gen 2, a blob, anything that's supported by Polybase, you can now do that. Okay, so that brings us home. A bunch of free and useful resources for you. Again, I'll make the deck available to Kevin, but I'll just quickly run through these before opening up the session for questions. What is S3 from AWS? There's AWS Data Lake reference architectures. You also have these on the Azure Architecture Center. There's a URL for downloading S5 CMD, CyberDuck. There's a link to my my repo containing the Python code that I showed you, and there's a ton of useful stuff in Microsoft's documentation. Okay, so that wraps things up for the presentation. Has anybody got any questions?
Please don't feel shy, because now is your one time to get an actual chance to talk to the man who knows what he's talking about.
Well, it's the one time to talk to me in person. I'm also on Twitter, so if you search out Chris Adkin 8, that is me. So yeah, don't be shy, folks. Okay, so what I'll do is, while I'm thinking about it, I will Microsoft Teams. Do you want me to upload the deck into chat?
Yeah, that'll be perfect.
Okay, messages. Okay, how do I chat? How do I do that, Kevin? I've never done this before.
You should have access to actually put it down in there, because there is a there is actually a place to actually put things like that.
Let's have a look. To do link.
Maybe not, actually. I actually don't have it in mind either, so no worries.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll email you the deck, Kevin, and I guess you'll have some sort of way of pushing it out to the people that attended.
We do.
Okay. Okay then, folks. Well, Kevin, thanks ever so much for having me. Everybody on the session, thanks ever so much for attending. I hope you got something out of that.